and was sure that a quiet life was ahead of him. But after just one night, a huge crack appeared in the basement. When he decided to check what was hidden behind the foundation, he was completely shocked. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. Marcus Hill had spent most of his life fixing other people's broken machines. For more than 40 years, he had worked in grease-stained coveralls, crawling under cars and cramped garages, coaxing seized engines back to life, taking pride in the small miracles of bolts turning loose after years of rust. It was not glamorous work, and it never paid the kind of money that bought vacations on the coast or brand new trucks every few years, but it kept food on the table, and little by little, it filled the coffee tin he kept hidden behind an old toolbox. That tin was his future. His quiet rebellion against the idea that he would end his days in some rented apartment that smelled of other people's lives. By the time he turned 60, the tin had become a box, and the box had become a bank account just large enough to make him brave. That was when he found the house on Brookside Drive, a squat, single-story place with a brick front and a sagging porch that looked out over a line of tired maple trees. It was not beautiful, but it was his. The price was suspiciously low, something the realtor explained away with vague talk about the owners needing to relocate quickly. Marcus had been cautious, more cautious than most, but fatigue had a way of dulling even the sharpest instincts. He had told himself that he had earned this, that he had earned the right not to look too closely at every shadow. The neighborhood welcomed him with the muted politeness of people who had learned not to expect much from new arrivals. There were no casseroles on his doorstep, no curious children peering through his windows, just a few nods from across the street and a man 2 houses down who raised a hand in greeting without bothering to slow his walk. It suited Marcus fine. He had always preferred quiet to ceremony. The house itself seemed solid enough at first glance. The roof had been patched recently, the windows sealed with fresh caulk, the paint in the living room a neutral shade that smelled faintly of ammonia. The basement was unfinished but dry, with concrete walls that bore the faint scars of age. He noticed a section near the far corner where the paint was a slightly different color, a shade darker, as if someone had touched it up in a hurry. He shrugged it off, as the kind of cosmetic work sellers did to make a place look better under harsh inspection lights. The first few days passed in a blur of cardboard boxes and small victories. He hung a calendar on the kitchen wall, set up his bed under the window that looked out on the maples, arranged his tools in the basement with a care usually reserved for surgical instruments. Each night he sat at the narrow table in the dining room, eating reheated leftovers and listening to the house settle around him. There was a comfort in those sounds, the gentle clicks and pops of cooling pipes, the low sigh of air slipping through unseen seams. The storm came on the 4th night without warning, as if the sky had been holding its breath all day. Marcus was standing at the sink when the first thunderclap rolled overhead, so loud it rattled the dishes in the cupboard. Rain followed in a sudden deluge, hammering the roof and windows with a violence that made him flinch. He switched off the kitchen light and watched the street through the glass, the world beyond reduced to streaks of silver and shadow. Somewhere in the distance a transformer blew, leaving the house in darkness broken only by the pale flash of lightning. He told himself it was just another Midwestern storm, nothing he hadn't lived through 100 times before. Yet, as he lay in bed later, he felt a vibration beneath him, so faint he might have imagined it. It was not the sharp jolt of thunder, but something lower, more persistent, a distant trembling that seemed to travel through the floor into his bones. He held his breath and listened, straining to separate the sound from the rush of rain. It reminded him of standing too close to a highway, of feeling the trucks before you heard them. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him under. Morning brought a weak, watery sun and the smell of wet earth. Marcus dressed slowly, his muscles stiff from the unfamiliar bed, and made his way to the basement to check for leaks. The concrete steps were cool under his bare feet, the air below heavy with a damp chill that raised goosebumps along his arms. He flicked on the light and stood still, trying to understand what he was seeing. A crack ran from near the ceiling down toward the floor, jagged and wide enough in places to slide a finger into. It was not the hairline fracture of settling concrete, not the spiderweb of age, but a violent, fresh wound in the wall. Gray dust lay in a crescent on the floor beneath it, as if the wall had shed its skin in the night. Marcus moved closer, his heart thudding in his chest, and placed his palm against the cold concrete. He could feel a whisper of air brushing his skin, a breath from somewhere beyond the wall. He stepped back, scanning the rest of the basement, but everything else looked unchanged. The boxes he had stacked along the opposite wall were still neatly aligned, the furnace silent and obedient. Only that crack, ugly and insistent, refused to make sense. He fetched a tape measure from his toolbox and measured the widest part, nearly half an inch. He marked the edges with a stub of chalk, his hand steady despite the creeping unease tightening his stomach. He had seen cracked engine blocks and warped frames, and he knew the difference between a flaw that had grown over years and one that had arrived like a punch. This was the latter. For a moment, he tried to reason it away. The storm had been fierce. The ground might have shifted. The foundation might be reacting to water where it shouldn't be. Old houses did strange things. Yet the cold draft on his skin and the hollow note the wall gave when he rapped his knuckles against it would not let him go. The sound was wrong, deeper than solid concrete had any right to be, a dull echo that made his pulse skip. He stood there for a long time, listening to the drip of water somewhere in the darkness behind the furnace, feeling the house loom over him like a silent witness. He thought of the coffee tin, of the years it had taken to fill it, of the way the seller's smile had never quite reached his eyes. Finally, he climbed back up the steps and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the calendar as if it might offer some explanation. Whatever had happened in the night was not finished with him. The crack in the wall was not just a flaw in the concrete, it was a message, a warning written in a language he had not yet learned to read. The crack stayed with Marcus all day, even when he wasn't looking at it. He went through the motions of settling in, carrying boxes from room to room, stacking books on the shelf he'd mounted the night before, hanging his coat on the hook by the back door. Each small task felt like an argument he was trying to win against the fear that had taken root in his chest. The house was his, he told himself. It had belonged to other people before him, and it had not swallowed them whole. Concrete cracked, old building shifted, storms did worse than most folks wanted to admit. But the memory of that cold breath seeping through the wall returned whenever he paused, whenever the rooms felt too quiet and his own thoughts grew loud. By noon, he had convinced himself, at least temporarily, that the smartest thing to do was to observe. Not panic. Not start knocking down walls like some desperate man in a horror story. He went back down to the basement with a flashlight and the tape measure, crouched close to the fracture, and checked the chalk marks he'd made earlier. The crack looked the same at first glance, the same jagged line like a lightning bolt frozen in concrete. Yet, when he slid the tape's metal end into the widest part, he felt it catch less tightly than before. The measurement was only a fraction different, the kind of change most people would miss or dismiss as imagination. But Marcus didn't miss it. He worked with tolerances every day. He knew what small shifts meant when they were part of something larger. He pressed his ear near the wall, ignoring the grit that scraped his cheek. At first, there was only his own breathing, the distant hum of the refrigerator upstairs. Then, faintly, a low sound like a far-off engine idling. It wasn't constant. It came in slow pulses, rising and falling as if something deep underground was waking and going back to sleep. He pulled away, skin prickling, and tapped the wall again with his knuckles. The hollow note answered him, deeper than it should have been, as if the concrete were only a thin skin over emptiness. He found himself walking the perimeter of the basement, searching for other signs. The floor looked level. The support posts stood straight. The walls, apart from that one, were unremarkable in the dull way basement walls usually were. But then he noticed a line near the bottom of the opposite wall where paint met concrete in an unnaturally clean edge. It looked like someone had sealed along the base not long ago, a bright band of caulk that hadn't yet yellowed with age. He crouched and ran a thumb over it. Fresh, too fresh. A memory surfaced of the realtor's hand waving vaguely as she talked about minor updates, her voice too cheerful in the dimness. Marcus had nodded then, distracted by his own excitement. Now, with the crack staring back at him like an accusation, those minor updates felt like the first clue in a story he had never agreed to be part of. He forced himself upstairs and made coffee, though it tasted like nothing. He ate a sandwich without feeling hunger. He tried to focus on practical matters. The utilities were in his name now. The insurance papers sat in a neat folder. The mailbox key was on the counter. Yet every time he moved, he felt the house under him in a new way, as if his feet were no longer on solid ground but on something that could shift without warning. In the late afternoon, the clouds returned, though not with the violence of the night before. A steady drizzle began, soft at first, then heavier, as if the sky had remembered it was not finished. Marcus watched it from the living room window. The water ran down the street in thin streams, collecting in low spots along the curb. He noticed how quickly the yard grew saturated, the soil darkening, the grass flattening. He told himself it was normal. It was winter edging toward spring, or spring pretending it was still winter, and the ground always held water longer than it should. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the earth beneath his house was drinking more than it could handle. As evening approached, he went down again to check the chalk marks. The crack had shed more dust. A fine gray powder lay on the floor like ashes. He measured again and confirmed what he feared. It had widened, not dramatically, but enough to be real. In one place, a thin line had branched off like a vein, running toward the corner. He stared at it until his eyes began to ache. In his mind, he saw a car frame bent by a collision. The first fracture always seemed small, manageable, until you looked closer and realized the entire structure was compromised. He remembered the way metal could fail without warning when fatigue set in, the way a part could hold under strain for years and then snap in a moment that felt arbitrary. Concrete could do the same. The ground beneath it could do worse. He went back upstairs and paced the narrow hallway, phone in his hand. Calling a contractor felt too early. Calling the city felt like admitting defeat. He didn't want to be the kind of man who bought a house and then immediately began demanding inspections like a panicked fool. He had pride, and pride had cost him before, but it still lived in him like a stubborn old habit. He didn't call anyone that night. Instead, he chose vigilance, the way he had always chosen it when an engine made a sound it shouldn't. Watch it. Listen. Learn the rhythm of the problem before you tore the whole thing apart. He tried to sleep. He lay in bed with the lights off, listening to the rain return in short bursts against the roof. The house seemed quieter than the night before, as if it were holding its breath. He closed his eyes and forced his muscles to relax. For a while it worked. His mind floated, half dreaming. Then the low vibration returned. It was subtle at first, barely more than the sensation of a truck passing on a distant road, but it didn't fade. It grew, a deep tremor that seemed to rise through the floorboards and into the frame of the bed. His water glass on the nightstand trembled, the surface quivering in small ripples. Marcus sat up, heart hammering, and listened. The sound had a rhythm now, like slow waves breaking against a shore. He swung his legs out of bed and stood barefoot on the wooden floor. The vibration seemed stronger at his feet. He walked into the hallway, placed a hand on the wall, and felt it faintly there, too. A thunderstorm could shake a house, but the sky was quiet now. This came from below, from the earth itself. He went to the kitchen, took the flashlight, and hesitated at the basement door. He could have stayed upstairs and called someone in the morning. That would have been the sensible thing. But Marcus had never been able to leave a problem untouched when he knew it was growing. He opened the door and descended, each step creaking under his weight. The basement light cast a harsh yellow glow. The crack was waiting, the chalk marks bright against the gray. The vibration was stronger down here, almost like a distant engine revving under load. He approached the wall slowly, keeping his weight evenly distributed, an absurd instinct as if the floor might suddenly give way beneath one foot. When he placed his palm near the crack, he felt the cold draft again, and something else. A faint trembling in the concrete itself, not from his touch but from within. He withdrew his hand, then leaned close enough that he could smell the wall. It carried the scent of wet stone and something metallic, like old tools left too long in a damp shed. A drop of water slid down from the ceiling and splashed on the floor near his shoe. Another followed. He traced the source with his light and found a thin line of moisture running along a pipe, but the pipe didn't look damaged. It looked as if the air itself had grown wetter, as if the basement were breathing in fog. He crouched and examined the base of the wall. The caulk line he had noticed earlier wasn't in this corner. Here, instead, someone had painted carefully over the concrete in a way that hid subtle differences in texture. Marcus angled his light and saw it, a patch, perhaps a foot wide, where the concrete was smoother, newer. The edge had been feathered into the surrounding wall with paint, but the join line was still there if you knew how to look. He pressed a fingernail into the paint. It lifted slightly, revealing beneath it a thin layer of filler that wasn't part of the original wall. He felt his stomach drop. This wasn't the kind of minor repair you made for aesthetics. This was the kind you made because you were trying to hide evidence. He straightened, breath coming faster now, and swept the flashlight beam across the wall. Another patch, smaller, near the corner, and a third near the floor, where someone had smeared something thick and then painted over it. Whoever had owned this house before him had been down here, looking at damage, and had chosen not to fix it properly. They had chosen to cover it. The vibration surged, then eased, as if something deep below had shifted its weight. Marcus backed away from the wall. He felt suddenly foolish for being alone down here, in a basement that might not remain a basement for long. He climbed the steps quickly, closing the door behind him as if it could keep the earth from reaching him. Upstairs, the house felt different. Not safer, just less immediate. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the phone. His fingers hovered over the screen. He thought of his nephew, Elijah. Technically, Elijah was his sister's son, but Marcus had been present in the boy's life in the way fathers sometimes weren't. Elijah had grown up around Marcus's tools and Marcus's patience, watching him fix what others had thrown away. Now, Elijah worked for a building assessment service, the kind of job that required a steady mind and a comfort with uncomfortable truths. If anyone could look at a crack and tell Marcus whether it was ordinary or catastrophic, it was him. Marcus called. Elijah answered on the third ring, voice sleepy and annoyed until he heard Marcus's tone. Marcus described the crack, the way it had appeared overnight, the way it seemed to widen, the cold air coming through. He mentioned the vibration, careful not to sound hysterical. There was a pause on the line, the sound of Elijah shifting in bed. "Uncle," Elijah said finally, "cracks happen. But a crack that big overnight isn't normal. And if you're feeling vibration with no storm, that's not something I'd ignore." "I'm not ignoring it," Marcus said, though his voice betrayed him. "Good," Elijah replied. His tone changed, sharpening into professional focus. He asked questions: the age of the house, the direction of the crack, whether the floor showed any heave, whether doors upstairs were sticking. Marcus answered as best he could. Elijah grew quiet again. "You said there was a storm," Elijah said. "Heavy rain?" "Hardest I've heard in a while," Marcus admitted. "Eliminates a few things, makes others more likely," Elijah murmured. "Could be hydrostatic pressure, could be soil movement, could be you've got a void under there that's collapsing. I don't want to guess over the phone." Marcus swallowed. "Can you come?" "I can come in the morning," Elijah said at once. "First thing. Don't go back down there tonight. I'm serious. Stay upstairs. If you hear anything get worse, if the floor shifts, get out of the house. Go to your car or go to a neighbor, promise me." Marcus hesitated, pride rising again like a reflex, then forced it down. "I promise," he said. Elijah exhaled. "I'll bring a thermal camera and a scope. We'll take a look. But, Uncle, don't mess with it tonight. Don't drill, don't chip at it. Just watch." After he hung up, Marcus sat in the dim kitchen with the phone in his hand, rain tapping softly at the window. He wanted to feel relief, but what he felt instead was the heavy confirmation that something was wrong enough to make Elijah's voice go sharp. He tried once more to sleep, but now his mind filled every silence with imagined sounds. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, counting his breaths. Every creak of the house made him tense. Every gust of wind outside sounded like a groan from below. At some point, he must have drifted, because he found himself half dreaming of old mines and tunnels, of men and soot-darkened faces disappearing underground. He saw wooden beams slick with water, heard the groan of timber under strain. He woke suddenly, sitting upright with his heart racing. The house was silent. Then, from somewhere beneath him, came a sound so distinct it erased all doubt. It was a short, sharp crack, like a thick plank snapping under pressure. It echoed faintly through the walls, followed by a soft, settling rumble, as if something had shifted and found a new place to rest. Marcus sat frozen in the dark, listening for what would come next. Nothing came. The silence returned, heavier than before, and in that silence he understood that the warning written in the basement wall was not finished being written. It was only taking its time. Marcus did not go back to sleep after the sound of snapping timber beneath his house. He lay in the darkness with his eyes open, watching the faint outline of the ceiling, listening to the long stretches of silence between the creaks that now seemed too loud, too deliberate. When dawn finally seeped into the room, gray and reluctant, he rose with a stiffness that had nothing to do with age. The promise he had made to Elijah weighed on him. Do not go back down there tonight. He had kept it, but the basement was calling to him now in a different way, not with vibration or cold breath, but with the dull certainty that whatever was happening was accelerating. Elijah arrived before 8, his car pulling into the driveway with a sense of purpose that contrasted sharply with the sleepy quiet of Brookside Drive. He stepped out with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a hard plastic case in the other hand. He looked younger than Marcus remembered, though that might have been the effect of seeing him through eyes sharpened by fear. He wore jeans and a dark jacket, his hair still slightly damp from a hurried shower. They hugged briefly at the door, a gesture that carried more weight than either of them would admit. Elijah did not waste time on small talk. His gaze swept the hallway, the living room, the closed basement door. "You okay?" he asked, though the question was almost rhetorical. "I didn't go back down," Marcus said, "but I heard something crack last night, like wood breaking." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Let's take a look," he said, and set his equipment down on the kitchen table. He opened the duffel and laid out his tools with a practiced care that reminded Marcus of the way he arranged his own wrenches. There was a handheld thermal imaging camera, a compact ground assessment device that looked like a flattened metal box with a small screen, a battery-powered drill with long masonry bits, and a flexible endoscopic camera coiled neatly like a sleeping snake. They descended into the basement together, moving slowly, listening. The vibration Marcus had felt in the night was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt temporary, like the pause between distant thunder and the rain that followed. The crack was the first thing Elijah saw. He crouched in front of it without touching, studying the chalk marks, the dust on the floor. "This is new," Elijah said softly. "This kind of separation doesn't happen all at once without a reason." He ran a finger a few inches from the crack, careful not to disturb anything. "You see how the edges aren't rounded? This hasn't been here long." Marcus nodded. He felt oddly relieved to have his fear validated. Elijah pulled out the thermal camera and turned it on. The small screen flickered to life in a wash of colors that represented heat differences invisible to the eye. He panned slowly across the wall, the ceiling, the floor. Most of the basement glowed in muted tones, the concrete holding the cold of the night. But when he swept over the crack, the colors shifted dramatically. A long, vertical band showed up in deep blues and purples, far colder than the surrounding wall. "See that?" Elijah said, angling the screen so Marcus could see. "That means there's air movement back there, not just dampness. A void." "How big?" Marcus asked. Elijah's mouth twisted in a way that was half apology, half professional restraint. "Big enough to matter," he said. "I don't know how far it goes yet, but that cold zone isn't something you get from a hairline fracture or a little pocket of water." He switched to the ground assessment device, placing it flat against the wall near the crack. The machine hummed softly, its screen filling with numbers and simple graphs that meant little to Marcus but clearly unsettled Elijah. He moved the device in small increments, mapping the area, his brow furrowing deeper with each pass. "There's a density anomaly behind this section," Elijah said finally. "The readings are all over the place. That means the material behind the wall isn't uniform. Could be loose soil, could be a cavity, could be something man-made that's decayed. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement air. Like a tunnel? Elijah didn't answer right away. He stood, stepped back, and looked at the wall as if trying to see through it with nothing but willpower. "Maybe," he said. "But before we jump to conclusions, let's check the rest of the basement." They spent the next half hour inspecting every corner. Elijah pointed out details Marcus might have missed, even with his growing unease. The paint along the bottom of the walls was newer than it should have been. Not just in one place, but in several, as if someone had worked systematically to seal the base. There were tiny variations in the concrete's texture that suggested patches rather than original construction. In one spot, near the furnace, Elijah found a faint outline beneath the paint that looked like the edge of an old repair plate. "This is concealment," Elijah said quietly. "Not cosmetic. Someone knew there was a problem and didn't want it noticed." They took a break upstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee that went untouched. Marcus spread out the paperwork from the sale, his fingers trembling as he flipped through inspection reports and disclosure forms. Everything looked clean. No mention of subsidence, no notes about structural risk, only the usual boilerplate about the property being sold as is. "They rushed the closing," Marcus said, the memory sharpening now. "The sellers said they had a family emergency. They kept apologizing for the short notice." Elijah shook his head slowly. "That doesn't mean guilt, but combined with what we're seeing..." He trailed off, then looked up at Marcus with something like anger in his eyes. "Uncle, I think you were set up. At best, they ignored a serious warning. At worst, they hid it." The words settled over Marcus like a weight. He had spent a lifetime believing that if you did your job well and treated people fairly, the world would meet you halfway. That belief had been chipped away over the years, but it had never been shattered. Now, it cracked, mirroring the wall below. They went back down, the unspoken decision made. If there was a void, they needed to see it. Not to satisfy curiosity, but to understand the risk. Elijah chose a spot a few inches from the main crack, where the thermal camera showed the coldest reading. He checked the floor around them, made sure they were standing on the opposite side of the basement, not directly under the fracture. "This might be nothing," he said, though his tone betrayed the lie, "but it might also make things worse. If there's pressure behind the wall, drilling could relieve it in unpredictable ways. So if I tell you to move, you move. No arguing." Marcus nodded. He had trusted Elijah with tools and engines since the boy was 12. Trusting him now was easier than trusting his own instincts. The drill bit bit into the concrete with a shrill whine. Dust puffed out around it, coating Elijah's gloves in gray. The vibration of the tool was a small, controlled thing compared to the deeper tremors Marcus had felt in the night, but it still made his nerves sing. The drill chewed through the wall inch by inch, and then, suddenly, the resistance vanished. A hiss of cold air burst from the hole, strong enough to flutter the loose hair at Marcus's temples. It carried with it a smell he could not place at first, something stale and metallic, like a long-abandoned workshop sealed for decades. Elijah shut off the drill and leaned back, eyes wide. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The basement felt different now, as if it had opened its mouth to reveal something it had been hiding. Elijah coiled the endoscopic camera, fitted its tip with a small LED ring, and fed it into the hole. The screen showed the interior of the wall at first, rough concrete giving way to darkness. The camera slid forward, the cable unwinding smoothly from Elijah's hand. The darkness persisted longer than either of them expected. Then the view shifted abruptly, the concrete edge falling away, replaced by nothing at all. The camera dangled, its tiny light illuminating only a fraction of the space it had entered. It swung slightly, revealing a curved metal surface far below, then something that looked like a ladder bolted into stone. A cloud of dust drifted through the beam, turning the darkness into a slow, underwater swirl. Marcus leaned closer, forgetting Elijah's warnings for a heartbeat. The image was both alien and disturbingly familiar, like stumbling on a photograph from another life. "That's not soil," Elijah whispered. "That's structure." As if in response, the basement shuddered. It was not the distant vibration of the night before, but a sharp, immediate tremor that made the light overhead flicker. The camera image blurred as the cable jerked in Elijah's grip. "Back up," Elijah said, his voice suddenly loud. "Marcus, back up now." They took 2 steps, then another. The wall groaned, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A hairline fracture shot out from the drilled hole, branching like a crack in ice. Dust poured down in a gray curtain, and then the wall began to move. It did not collapse inward, as Marcus might have expected, but outward, as if the concrete itself were being pulled into the void beyond. A section, the size of a refrigerator, broke free, tilting forward with a slow, terrible grace before gravity claimed it. The piece fell, striking something unseen below with a hollow, booming thud that echoed up into the basement like a drumbeat. Elijah yanked Marcus backward just as another chunk gave way. They stumbled, fell against the opposite wall, and watched in stunned silence as the fracture widened into a jagged opening that bled darkness. Dust filled the air, turning the basement into a foggy dreamscape where shapes lost their edges and sounds came from nowhere and everywhere at once. When the shaking stopped, the silence that followed was so complete it rang in Marcus's ears. The hole in the wall yawned before them, a wound that led into a depth no basement was ever meant to have. Cold air poured from it in steady waves, carrying the same metallic tang, now stronger, now undeniable. Marcus stared at it, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. He had wanted answers. He hadn't wanted this. The dust hung in the basement air like a curtain that refused to rise. Marcus tasted concrete on his tongue and felt it settle into the lines of his face, into the fabric of his shirt, into the folds of memory where the ordinary shape of his life had just been torn open. He stood frozen for several long seconds, unable to look away from the jagged mouth in the wall. It was not merely a hole, it was an invitation, a threat, a revelation all at once, framed by broken concrete that jutted inward like the shattered teeth of some buried creature. Elijah was the first to move. He coughed once, then twice, waving the air in front of his face as if trying to part the dust with his hand. He pulled Marcus another step away from the wall and planted his feet with the kind of focus that came from years of dealing with emergencies that never followed a script. "Are you hurt?" Elijah asked, his voice hoarse. Marcus shook his head, though his knees felt loose and his heart still hammered so hard it made him dizzy. He leaned against the far wall, dragging in breath after breath until the dust thinned enough for him to see clearly again. The hole gaped wider than he had thought in the chaos of the collapse. It was tall enough for a grown man to step into without ducking, and wide enough that Marcus could see beyond its edges into a space that had no business existing beneath his home. The camera cable still trailed from Elijah's hand into the darkness, its tiny light now illuminating only a small, trembling circle far below. Elijah glanced at the cable, then at the wall, then back at Marcus. "I'm calling this in," he said. This is beyond anything we handle on our own." He fumbled his phone from his pocket and stepped back farther, as if the distance alone could make the situation less real. As he spoke rapidly to emergency services, Marcus found himself drawn forward again, not out of recklessness, but out of a terrible need to understand. He crept closer to the opening, keeping his weight low, one hand braced against the solid part of the wall. The air flowing from the void was colder than the basement itself, carrying with it the scent of rust, damp stone, and something else that reminded him of old machine shops, of places where metal had been cut and left to oxidize in forgotten corners. He leaned closer and let his eyes adjust to the darkness. The beam from the camera swayed gently, revealing fragments of a hidden world. There were metal surfaces down there, long and flat, intersected by vertical supports. He thought of the ladder he had glimpsed earlier and tried to trace it now, imagining how far it descended. The scale of it defied the smallness of his basement. This was not a shallow cavity or a washed-out pocket of soil. This was a structure. Elijah finished his call and joined him, keeping a cautious distance. "Fire department's on the way. They're bringing engineers and urban rescue," he said. "They're telling us to stay put, but away from the opening." Marcus nodded absently. He could feel the pull of the darkness as something physical, as if the void were exerting its own gravity on him. The camera's light flickered as Elijah adjusted the cable, drawing it up a foot at a time to get a clearer view. The image on the small screen sharpened. Marcus saw a section of wall far below that had once been painted, the color now reduced to a patchy smear of faded green. There was a horizontal platform bolted into the rock, and beneath that, nothing but blackness. The beam caught on a curved metal pipe that disappeared into the dark, its surface flaking away in reddish scales. "What is this place?" Marcus whispered. Elijah didn't answer. He was watching the screen with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle under a time limit. He adjusted the angle, letting the camera drift toward the platform. As it did, the basement trembled again, this time with a quick, sharp jolt that made both men flinch. The vibration rippled through the floor, through Marcus's legs, up into his chest. It was followed by a sound so low and resonant it felt more than heard, a groan that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The cable twitched in Elijah's hand, as if something below had brushed it. "That's it," Elijah said, his voice tight. "We're done. Back away." He began to reel the camera in, hand over hand, careful not to jerk it. The image on the screen lurched, swinging wildly, catching glimpses of rusted beams and fractured stone. As the camera rose, the groaning sound deepened, growing louder until Marcus felt it in his teeth. The wall shuddered. Not a subtle tremor this time, but a violent convulsion that sent a cascade of debris raining down. Elijah shouted and pulled Marcus back, but Marcus's eyes were fixed on the opening. He saw a long crack tear upward from the hole, racing toward the ceiling like a living thing. The edges of the wall began to bow outward, concrete dust spraying in thin jets from invisible seams. The first major section gave way with a sound like a cannon firing underground. A slab of concrete tore loose, pivoted for an instant in midair, then vanished into the void with a hollow roar that echoed back up at them. The blast of air that followed knocked Marcus off his feet. He felt himself falling, felt Elijah's hand clamp onto his sleeve, felt his shoulder slam against the floor. For a moment, there was nothing but noise. Concrete shattered. Metal shrieked. The basement light flickered and went out, plunging them into a gray twilight lit only by the camera's erratic glow and the dust-choked daylight filtering in from the small windows above. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the collapse slowed and stopped. Marcus lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling that now seemed impossibly far away. His ears rang. His chest ached with every breath. He rolled onto his side and pushed himself up, coughing violently. Elijah was already on his feet, hauling Marcus upright with a grip that brooked no resistance. They retreated to the stairs, clinging to the railing as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. When they turned back, the basement they had known was gone. In its place was a chasm that swallowed nearly half the wall and a good portion of the floor beneath it. The opening now stretched from near the ceiling almost to the ground, its edges raw and crumbling. Through it, they could see deep into the earth, into a shaft that dropped farther than Marcus's flashlight beam could reach. The camera cable lay slack on the floor, severed near the opening. The rest of it, along with the camera itself, had been taken by the void. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The dust settled slowly, revealing more of what had been hidden. The shaft was not smooth like a natural cave, but angular, cut and reinforced by human hands. They could see segments of ladder bolted into the rock, their rungs bent and corroded. They could see the remnants of platforms and beams, their metal eaten away by decades of moisture. Far below, something glinted faintly in the camera's lost light, then disappeared as the dust thickened again. The sound that had haunted Marcus in the night returned, but this time it was unmistakable. It was the creak and snap of failing timbers, a brittle, splintering noise that echoed up from the depths in irregular bursts. Each one was followed by a muffled crash as something heavy gave way and fell. Fire sirens wailed in the distance, their approach both a comfort and a reminder of how far beyond his control this situation had become. Marcus slid down onto the bottom step, his legs suddenly unable to hold him any longer. Elijah stood beside him, one hand braced on the wall, his face pale beneath the dust. "That wasn't just a cavity," Elijah said at last. "That was a shaft, or a tunnel system, something old." Marcus nodded numbly. He thought of the faint metallic smell, the way the air had poured out as if from a long-sealed chamber. He thought of the patches in the wall, the fresh paint, the hurried sale. He felt a cold understanding settle into him, heavier than fear. The previous owners had not simply ignored a crack. They had lived over this, had known it was there, had chosen to hide it rather than confront it. They had walked away while the ground beneath the house was quite literally given up. The fire department arrived in a flurry of boots and shouted commands. They took in the scene with professional speed, stringing caution tape, positioning lights, sending one of their own to peer into the opening with a camera on a rigid pole. Engineers followed, their faces grim as they examined the fracture lines and the yawning shaft below. Marcus watched them work as if from a great distance. The house he had saved for, the place he had imagined growing old in, was no longer a home. It was a precarious perch over a black, waiting abyss. The fire trucks idled in front of the house like patient red beasts, their lights washing Brookside Drive in pulses of blue and scarlet that turned the quiet street into something unreal. Neighbors emerged from their homes in cautious clusters, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic pull of danger. Marcus stood wrapped in a blanket one of the paramedics had pressed into his hands, watching strangers walk through the front door of the place he had so recently called his own. Down in what remained of the basement, the fire department's urban rescue team worked with a methodical calm that bordered on reverence. They spoke in clipped phrases, their voices echoing strangely in the enlarged cavern that had once been a room. powerful lamps threw stark light into the shaft, revealing more detail with every adjustment. The hole was no longer a mystery shape swallowed by dust, but a vertical corridor carved deep into the bedrock, its walls scarred by the marks of drills and blasting tools from another era. An engineer with a silver beard and a clipboard stood near the edge, his boots planted wide for balance as he leaned forward to peer down. "This isn't natural," he said to no one in particular. "These supports are man-made. Look at the pattern on the stone. This was cut, reinforced, then abandoned." Marcus drifted closer, staying behind the yellow tape but hungry for information. He had always believed that problems became manageable once you could name them. He needed a name for this one. They lowered a rigid camera on a metal pole into the shaft, its high-definition feed transmitted to a tablet the engineer held in one gloved hand. The image was sharp enough to make Marcus's stomach turn. It showed a narrow landing bolted into the wall several feet below the opening, then another farther down, each one connected by ladders whose rungs had sagged under the weight of time. Beyond that, the shaft widened into a chamber that disappeared into shadow. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding small against the machinery and murmurs. The engineer glanced at him. "Hard to say yet," he replied, "but given the construction style, I'd guess mid-20th century at the latest. Could be an old utility access, a storage facility, or something military." The word hung in the air, heavier than the dust had been. Military. Marcus imagined soldiers and secret projects, the kind of things that never made it into public records. He imagined, too, how easy it would have been for a forgotten piece of infrastructure to slip through the cracks of bureaucracy, to be paved over and built upon until no one remembered it was there. A geologist arrived not long after, her hair tucked under a hard hat, her eyes bright with the mixture of excitement and concern that came from discovering something both fascinating and dangerous. She knelt near the opening, touching the exposed stone with gloved fingers, tracing the layers as if reading a story written in sediment. "This area was developed aggressively during the war years," she said when Marcus and Elijah introduced themselves. "Factories, storage depots, training facilities, records from that time aren't always complete, and even when they are, they're often sealed or misfiled. Whatever this is, it's been down there a long time." She gestured towards the damp streaks running along the shaft walls. "Those supports were never meant to last forever. Water gets in, metal rusts, wood rots. The storm last night probably pushed it past the breaking point. Hydrostatic pressure, groundwater infiltration, decades of corrosion. It's a perfect recipe for collapse." Marcus listened, the words forming a bleak logic in his mind. The low vibrations he had felt were not ghosts or imagination. They had been the sound of an old structure tearing itself apart in slow motion. The camera feed suddenly shifted, catching on something that made several people lean closer. A faded stencil appeared on the wall of the chamber, the letters blurred but still legible enough to make out a designation and a warning symbol. The geologist's breath caught. "That's a fuel storage marking," she said, "or at least it used to be. This was some kind of depot, possibly for petroleum or other flammable material." A murmur rippled through the gathered experts. That changed the stakes. A collapsing void was one thing. A collapsing void that might still contain residue from decades-old fuel tanks was another entirely. They cordoned off the house more thoroughly, extending the perimeter into the yard and across the sidewalk. A police officer approached Marcus with a clipboard and a careful expression. "Sir, we're going to need to evacuate you and anyone else inside the safety zone," he said. This structure is unstable and we can't rule out further collapse." Marcus nodded, though the words felt like a formality. The house had already been taken from him. Being told to leave it was merely the last step in a process that had begun the night the crack appeared. As he gathered a few belongings under supervision, he became acutely aware of the way the house sounded now. It was not the gentle settling he had noticed on his first nights here, but something strained, like a held breath. The walls seemed to hum faintly, a chorus of tiny noises that blended into an uneasy whole. Outside, the geologist and a team of engineers pored over maps and digital records pulled up on laptops. Marcus hovered nearby, catching fragments of conversation. They spoke of World War II, era emergency infrastructure, of underground storage facilities designed to protect vital resources from potential attacks. They mentioned how such sites were often decommissioned hastily after the war, sealed and forgotten as suburbs sprawled over them. "Elijah," Marcus said quietly, turning to his nephew. "All those patches in the basement, the paint, the caulk, that wasn't just hiding a crack, that was hiding this." Elijah nodded, his face set in a grim line. "Someone knew, or at least suspected. You don't do that kind of cosmetic work unless you're trying to keep something from being seen." A representative from the city arrived, her suit looking out of place among the hard hats and boots. She spoke in careful terms about public safety, about the need for a thorough investigation. Marcus watched her lips move, but the words slid past him. He was too busy replaying the image of the stencil in his mind, the ghost of a warning from another time bleeding through the dust. As the day wore on, more details emerged. The shaft was not a lone feature, but part of a network, branching horizontally beneath the property line. Preliminary scans suggested that the underground complex extended farther than just Marcus's lot, possibly under neighboring yards. The idea that other families were unknowingly living above the same decaying structure made his stomach twist. By evening, the experts had a working theory. During the war, the federal government had commissioned a series of underground depots in the region designed to store fuel and munitions away from vulnerable surface facilities. After the war, many of these sites were abandoned rather than properly dismantled, their entrances sealed and their existence slowly erased from public awareness. Over time, land was sold, houses were built, and the memory of what lay beneath was lost to everyone except perhaps a few archivists and, apparently, the people who had owned Marcus's house before him. The storm had been the final insult. Water had seeped into the old tunnels through cracks in the rock, pooling around supports that had been corroding for decades. The additional weight and pressure had caused one of the main beams to fail, triggering a chain reaction of collapses that traveled upward until it reached the weakest point, the patched wall in Marcus's basement. The knowledge brought no comfort, but it brought clarity. The sounds he had heard were not random. They were the death throes of a forgotten machine, a system built for a world at war and left to rot in a world that preferred not to remember it. As night fell, the street emptied again, the spectacle over for all but those whose jobs required them to stay. Marcus stood across the road, watching the silhouette of his house against the glow of portable floodlights. It looked smaller now, fragile in a way it had not when he first saw it. He thought of the previous owners, of the fresh paint and hurried sale. He imagined them standing in the same basement, staring at hairline fractures, hearing faint rumbles in the night. He imagined the choice they had made to cover and conceal, to pass the danger on rather than confront it. Had he not noticed the crack, had he dismissed it as just another quirk of an old building, he might have gone to bed one night and never woken up. The floor beneath him could have given way, dropping him into a vertical grave he never knew existed. The geologist joined him at the curb, her helmet tucked under her arm. "You were lucky," she said gently. Marcus looked at her. Lucky doesn't feel like the right word. She gave a small, tired smile. Sometimes it's the only one we have. The following days unfolded with a grim inevitability that Marcus could neither hasten nor escape. The city had condemned the house almost immediately after the initial assessment, posting bright orange notices on the front door and stretching more tape around the perimeter like a warning no one could miss. From the outside, it still looked like the modest home he had fallen in love with, but now he knew it was nothing more than a fragile shell balanced above a decaying underworld. He stayed with Elijah for the time being, sleeping on a narrow couch in the spare room, his belongings reduced to a few hastily packed boxes. Each morning he woke with the same heavy thought pressing on his chest. He had not simply lost a house. He had been fooled, and the sense of betrayal cut deeper than the fear ever had. The investigation began quietly, with phone calls and emails that felt too formal to match the chaos of the situation. Insurance adjusters wanted statements. City officials requested copies of the purchase agreement. Lawyers circled like cautious birds, offering consultations that came with disclaimers and fine print. Marcus answered every question he was asked, sometimes repeating the same details so often that he could recite them without thinking. The basement photographs Elijah had taken before the collapse became a crucial piece of evidence. The patches in the wall, the mismatched paint, the careful sealing along the base of the concrete were no longer just suspicious details, but potential proof of intent. When the investigators compared them to images taken after the collapse, the difference was stark. What had been disguised now lay exposed, the raw edges of the concrete telling a story the cosmetic repairs had tried to erase. One afternoon, a structural engineer named Harold came to Elijah's house to speak with Marcus. He carried a folder thick with printouts and diagrams, and when he spread them across the dining table, Marcus saw his own basement rendered in technical lines and shaded areas. "We've been reconstructing the sequence of events," Harold said, tapping one of the diagrams. "This is where the main support beam appears to have failed, deep in the underground complex. That caused a progressive collapse upward. But this area here," he added, pointing to the location of the patched wall, "was already compromised. The stress fractures were there before the storm." Marcus leaned closer. "How can you tell?" "The micro cracks in the concrete show signs of having been filled and sealed," Harold replied. "That doesn't happen accidentally. Someone repaired them, and not recently. Probably months, maybe longer. The storm was just the trigger, not the cause." The words settled like lead in Marcus's stomach. Months. That meant the previous owners had lived with the knowledge that something beneath their home was failing. They had chosen to conceal it rather than confront it. The city's legal department became involved soon after. They pulled old permits and planning documents, some of them so faded they had to be digitized and enhanced to be readable. Marcus was invited to sit in on one of the briefings, more as a courtesy than a necessity, but he found himself strangely compelled to attend. He wanted to see the paper trail that had led him here. The records were incomplete, but they painted a troubling picture. In the late 1940s, the land beneath Brookside Drive had been the part of a federally funded project, a network of underground storage facilities designed to house fuel reserves. When the program was dismantled in the early 1950s, the sites were sealed, their entrances buried, and responsibility for the land transferred back to local authorities with little more than a note in an archive. Over the decades, that note had been lost in the shuffle of development. What should have been a permanent restriction on construction became, through neglect and bureaucratic inertia, a forgotten detail. Houses were built, families moved in, the underground world decayed unseen. But the most damning discovery had nothing to do with federal oversight. It came from a file buried in the county clerk's office, a folder miscategorized under routine property maintenance. Inside it was a handwritten complaint from the previous owner of Marcus's house, dated almost a year before the sale. The complaint described strange noises beneath the basement, unexplained cracks in the foundation, and a request for an inspection. The inspection had taken place. The report noted anomalous conditions and recommended further evaluation. There was no record of that evaluation ever being carried out. Instead, there was a sudden burst of activity related to the property: permits for cosmetic repairs, invoices for paint and sealant, and then, not long after, the listing of the house for sale. When Marcus read the words in that complaint, written in a careful, almost timid hand, he felt a cold fury rise in him. This was not ignorance. This was not a mistake. It was a decision. The police questioned him formally the next day, their tone gentle but their intent clear. They wanted to know everything he could remember about the sellers, their demeanor, the way they spoke about the house, any hints of urgency or evasion. Marcus told them about the hurried closing, the repeated apologies, the way the seller had insisted that the basement had always been dry, despite the fresh caulk along the walls. They were afraid, Marcus said at one point, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. They weren't just in a rush. They were afraid to stay there. The detectives exchanged a look that needed no explanation. Fear was a motive they understood well. As the investigation widened, more pieces fell into place. The previous owners had contacted at least 2 contractors in the months before the sale, requesting estimates for foundation repair. One of those contractors had declined the job, citing the likelihood of a subsurface void and the need for a specialized assessment. His email, retrieved from an archived server, was blunt in its warning. Proceeding without a thorough geological survey would be dangerous. Instead of following that advice, the owners had chosen the cheapest and quietest option. They had patched the visible cracks, painted over the scars, and put the house on the market. Marcus struggled with the anger that came in waves now, sometimes catching him off guard in the middle of mundane moments. He would be making a sandwich or folding laundry at Elijah's place when the image of that complaint, those invoices, would rise in his mind like a slap. It was one thing to be unlucky. It was another to be deliberately put in harm's way. The city attorney met with him late one afternoon, her expression a careful blend of sympathy and professional distance. She explained his options in measured terms, outlining the possibility of civil action, of criminal charges for fraud if intent could be proven beyond doubt. "You have a strong case," she said. "The documentation we've uncovered suggests that the sellers knew of a potentially catastrophic defect and took steps to conceal it. That crosses a legal threshold." Marcus listened, nodding, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was thinking about the night he had heard the timbers snapping underground, about how close he had come to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The law could define fraud, could assign blame and penalties, but it could not quantify how narrow the margin had been between his ordinary life and an unmarked grave. When he left the attorney's office, He did not feel triumphant or vindicated. He felt tired, but beneath that fatigue was a resolve he had not felt in years. He would not let this be quietly settled, buried under paperwork and procedural delays. He would see it through, not just for himself, but for the neighbors who had unknowingly lived above the same decaying structure. That evening, a local reporter called, having caught wind of the story through the fire department's public statements. Marcus hesitated before agreeing to speak. He had never liked attention, never imagined his face on the evening news. But Elijah's words echoed in his mind. If you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you. He gave the interview the next day, standing across the street from his condemned house while a camera recorded his words. He spoke about the crack, the sounds, the collapse. He spoke about the documents that showed the previous owners had known and chosen to hide the truth. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He simply told the story as it had unfolded. By the time the segment aired that night, his phone was buzzing with messages from strangers. Some offered sympathy. Others shared their own stories of hidden defects and rushed sales. A few asked questions about their own basements, their own uneasy sounds in the night. Marcus sat on Elijah's couch, the television muted, watching the footage play across the screen. He saw himself older than he felt, wearier than he had ever been, but also steadier. For the first time since the crack had appeared, he sensed that the ground beneath him, metaphorically at least, was beginning to solidify. The deception had been uncovered. What remained was the reckoning. In the weeks that followed the exposure of the underground complex, Marcus's life took on a rhythm he had never anticipated. It was no longer measured by work hours or weekend errands, but by scheduled meetings with city officials, insurance representatives, engineers, and lawyers. Each appointment felt like a small piece in a sprawling puzzle, one that was slowly assembling itself into a picture he wished he had never had to see. The house on Brookside Drive was officially declared unsafe within days of the collapse. A printed notice was affixed to the front door, its legal language final and unyielding. Entry was prohibited. The structure was to be evaluated for demolition or complete remediation, whichever the city deemed necessary to eliminate the risk posed by the subterranean void. For Marcus, that notice was more than a piece of paper. It was the end of the life he had imagined in that place. He was allowed to return once more under supervision, escorted by a city inspector and a firefighter to retrieve any remaining personal items. He walked through the room slowly, as if each step might be the last time he ever saw that particular angle of light on the wall or that scuff on the floor. The house felt hollow now, stripped not only of furniture but of possibility. When he stood at the top of the basement stairs and looked down at the barricaded opening, he felt the familiar chill rise along his spine. Somewhere beneath those boards and warning signs lay the chasm that had rewritten his future. Outside, the street had become a staging ground. Heavy trucks lined the curb, their engines rumbling with patient menace. Teams of workers in hard hats and reflective vests moved in coordinated patterns, setting up fencing and unloading equipment. The operation was no longer about investigating a mystery. It was about neutralizing a threat. Marcus watched from across the road as drilling rigs were positioned over the worst of the subsidence. He learned that the plan was to stabilize the underground complex by filling critical sections with a specialized concrete mixture, a slow process designed to prevent further collapse while sealing off the decaying tunnels forever. It was a delicate balance between erasing the danger and preserving enough of the surrounding ground to keep neighboring houses from being affected. The geologist he had met on the night of the collapse stopped by to explain the procedure in terms he could understand. She spoke of controlled grouting, of pressure monitoring, of the way the injected material would seek out voids and harden into a new artificial bedrock. Marcus listened, trying to picture it, trying to reconcile the idea of liquid stone flowing through the darkness beneath his former home. When the first phase began, he felt it before he saw it. A low vibration traveled through the soles of his shoes as the machinery roared to life. It was different from the ominous tremors of that terrible night. This vibration was purposeful, contained, a sound of repair rather than destruction. Still, it made him uneasy. He had learned too well that the earth could not always be trusted. As days turned into weeks, the operation expanded. More equipment arrived, along with additional experts who pored over maps and cross-sections of the underground facility. They discovered that the network extended farther than initially thought, branching out beneath multiple properties. The city organized community meetings, explaining the situation to the neighbors who had once looked at Marcus with casual curiosity. Now they sat in folding chairs in the high school gym, faces pale as they listened to the story of forgotten fuel depots and rotting supports beneath their lawns. Marcus attended those meetings, standing up when asked to share his experience. He did not dramatize the events. He spoke plainly about the crack, the cold air, the camera disappearing into the void. He watched the expressions around him shift from disbelief to dawning fear. More than once, someone approached him afterward with tears in their eyes, grateful that his vigilance had brought the danger to light before anyone else was hurt. The legal process moved at a glacial pace by comparison, but it did move. The previous owners were formally charged with fraudulent concealment, the evidence against them too substantial to ignore. The handwritten complaint, the ignored inspection report, the invoices for cosmetic repairs all combined into a narrative that was difficult to dispute. Marcus was called to give a deposition, sitting in a quiet room with a recorder on the table as he recounted every detail of the sale, every strange comment, every fresh patch of paint that had once seemed so inconsequential. It was draining work, reliving the moments that had led him here, but there was also a strange sense of closure in speaking them aloud. Each word he offered felt like another brick laid in the foundation of accountability. The question of compensation was more complicated. His insurance policy had clauses that made his head spin, and the city's involvement blurred the lines of responsibility. In the end, it was a combination of municipal funds earmarked for infrastructure failures and a federal program tied to the remediation of decommissioned military sites that provided him with a settlement. It was not enough to erase the ordeal, but it was enough to give him options. Enough to start again. He began to look at other houses, though the process was different now. Where once he had been guided by instinct and a desire for simplicity, he was now meticulous to the point of obsession. He requested geological surveys. He pored over historical records. He asked questions that made realtors uncomfortable. Some houses he dismissed immediately, uneasy with the way their basements smelled or the way the floors creaked beneath his weight. Through it all, Elijah remained at his side, a steady presence who understood when Marcus needed to talk and when he needed silence. On the evening, Marcus finally signed a lease on a small apartment closer to the city, something temporary while he decided on a more permanent move. Elijah took him out for dinner. They sat in a quiet diner, the kind with laminated menus and faded photographs on the walls, and for the first time in months, they talked about things that had nothing to do with cracks or lawsuits or underground voids. Not long after, the final phase of the stabilization project began. Marcus returned to Brookside Drive one last time to watch it. The house was surrounded by machinery now, its modest shape dwarfed by cranes and mixers. Workers drilled into the ground around the foundation, pumping the concrete mixture down into the depths where the forgotten depot had once been. He imagined it flowing through the dark corridors, filling the spaces where beams had rotted and platforms had collapsed, sealing away the past. When the operation was complete, the site looked strangely ordinary. The yard was a churned expanse of dirt, the basement opening sealed and reinforced, the house itself scheduled for demolition within the month. The black abyss that had terrified him no longer existed as a physical threat, but its memory lingered like an afterimage burned into his mind. He stood across the street, hands in his pockets, watching a backhoe idle where his front door had once been. The air smelled of diesel and wet soil. It was not the smell of a home, but it was the smell of an ending. Marcus thought about the life he might have led if he had ignored that crack. He saw himself descending those basement stairs one evening, carrying a box of tools or a basket of laundry, never knowing that the floor beneath him had thinned to a shell. He pictured the suddenness of it, the lack of warning, the way a man could simply vanish into the earth and be reduced to a line in a report. Instead, he was here, alive, battered but upright, watching the ground reclaim a secret it had held for more than 70 years. He had lost a house, but he had kept his life, and in the balance between those two things, the scales were clear. When the backhoe finally roared to life and the first section of his former home began to come down, Marcus did not look away. He watched until the walls fell inward and the roof sagged, until the place he had once imagined growing old in was reduced to rubble. Only then did he turn and walk back to his car, leaving behind the quiet street and the hidden world beneath it, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the smallest cracks were the only warnings you would ever get. If this story shocked you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens in the next videos. Watch the other stories on the channel to see even more unbelievable discoveries. Share this video with someone who loves real-life mysteries and let us